Jenny was 23 and in a tight spot. She was struggling to make rent after her roommate bailed without notice, taking most of their shared stuff with her. Desperate for some quick cash, Jenny turned to Craigslist, a place where people sold everything under the sun: furniture, electronics, and, unfortunately, even their weirdest fantasies. She planned to sell a few things, nothing major, but enough to keep her head above water until she could find a new roommate. She didn't realize, of course, that in doing so, she would become part of someone else's twisted plan. The first ad she posted was for a vintage mirror she'd inherited from her grandmother, a gorgeous but eerie-looking thing. Heavy, with a thick, ornate frame carved from a dark wood that had an almost reddish hue. Her grandma had warned her it was no ordinary mirror. As a kid, Jenny used to think she saw things moving in its reflection, shadows darting by, even if she was alone in the room. She was more than happy to part with it. The ad went up, and in less than an hour, she received a response. A man named Harold sent her an email asking if he could come by that night to pick it up. "I'll pay double if you hold it for me," he wrote, adding a few too many smiley faces for comfort. But money was money, and she thought she might just be overthinking it. When she told him he could pick it up at 8 p.m., he responded instantly, saying, "Perfect, I'll see you then," followed by an unsettling, almost obsessive string of emojis. As 8 p.m. neared, she started feeling anxious. The last thing she needed was some Craigslist creep knowing where she lived. To ease her nerves, she texted her neighbor Adam, asking if he'd mind coming over while she made the sale. He was a tall, broad-shouldered guy, and they'd become friendly over the last few months, sharing beers on the front steps and chatting about work. He texted back, saying he'd come right over. Jenny felt a bit safer as she paced around her apartment, glancing nervously at the clock every few minutes. When Harold finally showed up, Adam was already there, sitting on the couch, arms crossed in a subtly protective stance. Jenny opened the door and was immediately unsettled by Harold's appearance. He was taller than she expected, dressed in an oversized trench coat that was frayed at the edges. His hair was greasy and matted, and his eyes darted around the apartment, lingering on Adam for just a second too long before settling on Jenny. He didn't smile. Instead, he just stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, barely blinking as he stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Harold asked to see the mirror, his voice low and breathy. She gestured towards it, and his face lit up in a way that was almost childlike. He walked over to the mirror, staring at it with a look of fascination that bordered on obsession. Jenny and Adam exchanged a quick, wary glance. "How much did you say you wanted for it again?" he asked, though he already knew the price. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled out a wad of cash and held it out to her, not breaking eye contact as she took it. Just as they were finalizing the deal, he leaned in close enough that she could smell something rancid on his breath. "This mirror has seen a lot, hasn't it?" he whispered, his voice tinged with something darker, more knowing. Jenny shivered. She hadn't told him anything about the mirror's history. "How did you?" "Beautiful piece," he interrupted, his voice louder now. "Thank you for keeping it safe for me." His eyes were still locked on hers, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something about her life, her struggles, maybe even things she hadn't told anyone. The way he said safe made her stomach twist. Without another word, he hoisted the mirror under his arm and left, his coat trailing behind him like a dark shadow. The moment he stepped out, Jenny locked the door and turned to Adam, who was staring at her, clearly just as shaken as she was. "That guy was off," he muttered. She nodded, hugging herself. "You don't think he'll come back, do you?" "I'll keep an eye out," Adam assured her. He stayed with her a little longer until she finally managed to calm down. But that night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured Harold's eyes, unblinking and intense, reflecting her own distorted image. The following day, Jenny tried to put the encounter behind her, but something gnawed at her. A weird urge to see if Harold had posted the mirror himself. She found herself back on Craigslist, scrolling obsessively, though she wasn't even sure what she was looking for. That's when she saw it, a new post from Harold's account, the same one he'd used to contact her. The listing title read, "The Mirror Remembers," and her heart stopped. She clicked on it, holding her breath. The description was chilling, a unique mirror with memories of every soul who has ever looked into it. A portal to see things as they truly are. for serious inquiries only. She could barely breathe. Her mind raced back to her grandma's warning and the shadows she'd seen in the mirror as a child. This couldn't be real. It had to be a coincidence. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She decided to ignore it, but over the next few nights, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her apartment felt different, heavier, like something was lurking just out of sight. She started hearing strange noises, soft whispers, barely audible, that seemed to come from her bedroom mirror. She told herself it was her imagination, the remnants of her nerves from the Craigslist ordeal. But the noises continued, growing louder, more insistent. On the third night, she finally gathered the courage to confront the mirror. She switched on the light and stood in front of it, staring at her reflection. At first, everything seemed normal, but as she continued to watch, her reflection began to change. Her face twisted, her eyes darkened, and a cold smile spread across her face, even though she wasn't smiling. She backed away, her heart pounding. That wasn't her in the mirror. It was someone else, something else, and it was staring back at her with a look of pure malice. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see an email notification. It was from Harold. "Did you really think you were rid of it?" The email read. "It's still with you. It always will be." Jenny screamed, throwing her phone across the room. She didn't sleep that night, and when dawn broke, she packed her things and left her apartment, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her. As she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror, and for a split second, she saw Harold's face, smiling back at her. From that day forward, she avoided mirrors whenever she could. But sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, she swore she saw something dark moving, just waiting for her to look a little too long. She never did. And to this day, she'll tell anyone who will listen, don't buy or sell anything on Craigslist, especially not a mirror. It was 3 in the morning when Mark posted the ad on Craigslist. Roommate needed ASAP, he typed, explaining that he had a 1-bedroom apartment but would let the new roommate take the bedroom if they were willing to split the rent. It was a quick fix. Desperation led him to overlook just how strange it was for someone to move into a 1-bedroom without asking to see the place first. The reply came just minutes after the ad went live. It was from someone named Owen, who said he'd been looking for a place and was ready to move in that very night. Mark hesitated. He was alone, and this stranger could be anyone. But when Owen mentioned he'd pay 3 months' rent up front, his hesitation vanished. He needed the money, and besides, he had a deadbolt. They agreed to meet at Mark's apartment in an hour. When Mark opened the door, he was surprised by Owen's appearance. He was gaunt and pale, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept in days. His clothes hung loosely, like they were borrowed from someone twice his size, and his hands twitched as he introduced himself. Mark pushed his unease aside. After a brief chat, Owen handed over a stack of cash as promised, and without another word, walked into the bedroom, shutting the door behind him. Mark, feeling a bit unnerved but grateful for the cash, decided to leave Owen to his privacy. The first night was uneventful, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The bedroom door remained closed at all times, and he heard strange, low murmurs coming from inside, sometimes soft and almost pleading, like a desperate conversation held alone. He wondered if Owen was talking in his sleep, but then, just as he was about to knock and ask, the murmurs would stop. One night, he woke up to the sound of shuffling in the kitchen. He sat up, heart pounding, and looked toward the kitchen, where the faint light from the fridge cast long shadows across the floor. Owen was there, standing motionless in front of the open fridge, staring blankly inside. Mark cleared his throat, asking if he was okay, but Owen didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned, his eyes meeting Mark's with a distant, hollow look. His lips parted, as if he were about to speak, but no words came out. Mark asked again if Owen was okay, but Owen just stood there, unmoving. Mark took a step forward, but Owen suddenly bolted, rushing back to his room and slamming the door shut. The sound echoed through the apartment, and Mark stood there, his skin crawling. The next day, Mark tried asking Owen if he needed help or if there was something he should know. Owen dismissed him with a weak smile and assured him he was just settling in. The excuses didn't sit right, but Mark let it go. Days turned into weeks, and the noises grew louder. Every night, Mark would hear Owen pacing in his room, murmuring, sometimes weeping. And then, as suddenly as they'd started, the noises stopped. Mark barely saw Owen for the next few days, but his door remained closed. When he knocked to check on him, there was no answer. Finally, out of concern, Mark tried the door, surprised to find it unlocked. He hesitated, but pushed the door open, only to find the room empty. There was no sign of Owen, no belongings, nothing to suggest anyone had ever been there at all. Confused and disturbed, Mark called Owen's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The next morning, he found a crumpled piece of paper slipped under his door. On it, in barely legible writing, was a note. "I'm sorry. I thought it was just a dream, but it's here. Don't look in the mirror." Mark was terrified, but curiosity won over fear. He approached the small bathroom mirror, telling himself it was all in his head. But when he looked up, he froze. In the reflection, Owen stood directly behind him, his eyes wide and hollow, staring at him with a look of despair that sent a chill down Mark's spine. His mouth moved as though he were screaming, but no sound came out. Mark spun around, but the bathroom was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the reflection was normal. Just him, pale and sweating. But from that night on, every time he glanced in a mirror, he'd catch a glimpse of Owen, staring back at him, his mouth silently pleading for help, trapped forever in that empty room. Carla had just moved into her first apartment, a cozy, slightly run-down place on the edge of town. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that made her feel secure, until she decided to look for a dresser on Craigslist. She found one that seemed perfect, a solid wood antique dresser listed at an unusually low price. The seller, who went by Mr. Hale, said he was clearing out his late mother's belongings. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his mother had quite an attachment to it. Carla brushed it off, assuming it was just a sentimental piece. She arranged to pick it up that evening. Mr. Hale's house was on an old, isolated property surrounded by thick trees. The place felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the long, winding path that led to the door. There was something about the house itself, the way it seemed to slump in the shadows, watching her approach. She hesitated before knocking, but finally Mr. Hale opened the door. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with piercing blue eyes and a smile that looked more like a grimace. He greeted her warmly, though his eyes never quite met hers, and he led her inside to the dresser. The place was dimly lit, the walls covered with old family portraits. Each one seemed to watch her as she followed him. The dresser was beautiful, made of dark mahogany with intricate carvings, and it looked far older than she'd expected. There was something oddly inviting about it, as though it were calling to her. She ran her hand over the surface, feeling a chill spread through her fingertips. Mr. Hale noticed and gave her an unsettling look. "You feel it, don't you?" he murmured, almost to himself. Carla just laughed it off, eager to leave. She paid him in cash, and he helped her load the dresser into her car. Before she drove off, he leaned in close to her window, his face pale and serious. "Lad, don't open the bottom drawer," he warned. "It's safer that way." She tried to laugh it off, but the look on his face stuck with her all the way home. That night, as she settled in, she couldn't get Mr. Hale's warning out of her head. Don't open the bottom drawer. It was ridiculous. What was the harm in looking? Finally, curiosity got the better of her, and she opened the dresser's drawers one by one. Nothing unusual. A few stray bits of lace caught in the corners, the smell of old wood. But when she pulled on the bottom drawer, it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she tugged, it stayed firmly in place. Frustrated, she went to bed, determined to figure it out in the morning. But as she drifted off, strange dreams took hold of her. In the dreams, she was standing in an empty room, lit only by the dim glow of candlelight. She felt compelled to approach the dresser, and as she did, she could see the faint outline of a figure in the reflection of its polished wood surface, an old woman with hollow eyes standing just behind her. Carla woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. She tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to stress. But each night the dream returned, growing more vivid each time. The old woman's face became clearer, her expression more desperate, and her whispering more insistent. Carla couldn't make out the words, but the pleading tone haunted her. One night, unable to bear it any longer, she returned to the dresser. She grabbed a screwdriver and pried the bottom drawer open. With a crack, the drawer slid free, revealing a small, leather-bound journal lying beneath a thin layer of dust. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, feeling that same chill she'd felt the first time she touched the dresser. The journal's entries were disjointed, the handwriting messy and frantic. The words seemed to bleed together, but one phrase appeared again and again. She's watching. She's always watching. As she read further, she realized the entries were written by Mr. Hale's mother. She spoke of strange visions, of seeing a dark figure in the mirror, a woman she didn't recognize, but who was always lurking just behind her reflection. She wrote of whispers in the night, of the cold touch of fingers brushing her skin when no one was there. Carla's pulse quickened as she reached the final entry, which ended abruptly. I tried to close her in, to lock her away, but I can feel her watching through the wood. I know she waits for me in the mirror. Soon, she'll be free. A loud thud sounded from the dresser, making Carla drop the journal. She stared at the bottom drawer, her heart pounding as the sound came again, this time louder. A scratching noise began, like nails dragging across wood, growing faster and more frantic. She stumbled back, watching in horror as the bottom drawer slowly, impossibly began to slide open on its own. A figure began to emerge, a faint, shadowy form that took shape in the dim light. The old woman's face was just as Carla had seen in her dreams, pale, hollow-eyed, and grinning with a kind of madness that chilled her to the bone. Carla couldn't move, frozen as the woman's cold, empty eyes met hers. And then the woman's lips moved, whispering in a voice that sounded like the groan of wood under pressure. I told him he couldn't keep me in. Now, you'll keep me company. The last thing Carla remembered was the feeling of icy hands gripping her arms, pulling her toward the dresser, her own face reflected in the polished wood, mouth open in a silent scream. When the landlord came to check on Carla weeks later, he found the apartment empty. Her phone and keys were on the kitchen counter, her clothes still in the closet. And in the corner of the room, he noticed the old dresser, the bottom drawer slightly ajar, with the faintest whisper seeping from within. To this day, if you pass by that apartment and listen closely, some say you can still hear Carla's muffled voice, begging for someone, anyone, to open the drawer.